Hey there, my name's Justin. I'm one of the pastors at Hope City. I'm really glad you're checking out this week's message. I hope you'll take a minute, look around our website, visit our YouTube channel, and download the Hope City app by searching Hope City Indy in the App Store or Google Play Store. There's great content on the app that goes far beyond weekend services. Hope City is a place where you can belong before you believe. No matter where you come from today spiritually, I hope this message helps you find hope and move closer to Jesus. Enjoy the message.
What is up, everybody? How we doing? Very good? Good deal. Hey, you guys are taking social distancing in the room to a whole new level. I appreciate that. Keeping safe, that's of utmost importance. Hey, my name's Justin. I am one of the pastors here. I want to say welcome to you. If you're a guest, I want to say a special welcome to you. So glad that you're here. If you're watching online from home today or on the road, wherever you might be, Hope City is a place where you can belong before you believe. And no matter where you come from today spiritually, we hope that you feel welcome. And we hope that you feel at home. I want to talk about Core 4 for just a second. We kicked it off last week. It was really awesome. We just had a lot of momentum, a lot of energy in the room. Core 4, basically, if you've been here for a week or you've been here since day one, it's just a gathering for the next 3 weeks, tonight and the next 2 weeks after that, at 6:30 here at the church. We're walking through the book of Acts. We're talking about God's vision for the church, and specifically God's vision for Hope City Church. And really, some crucial steps that we're taking over the next month or so for the next 5 years of our church story. And so I'm excited about it. I want to invite you to come. There's snacks, all right? And it's an awesome time. It's really intimate. We have some worship. We have some fun stuff that we do together. And then we dive into God's Word, and we're talking about Acts chapter 2 tonight. So can't wait for that. Well, we are in week 3 of this series called Stronger, and we've based this series on this verse found in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where the Apostle Paul is going through kind of a mental, emotional, and spiritual, and definitely a physical crisis. And he comes to this place in his relationship with God where he is experiencing pain physically, he's experienced pain emotionally and spiritually, and he begins to beg God to take away whatever it is that he is going through. And he says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to remove this thorn from my flesh, and God responds, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. And so over the last few weeks, we've talked about how in order for us to grow stronger, in order for us to come out of the pandemic, whenever that might be, stronger, we have to admit weakness. We have to come face to face with our weaknesses, submit those to God, so that He can then give us His strength, which is exponentially stronger than anything that we could muster or fake. And so the first week, we talked about how to have stronger families. Last week, we talked about how to have stronger faith. Next week, we're talking about how to be stronger spiritually. And then the last week, we're going to talk about how to have stronger friendships. Today, I want to talk about how to be a stronger church. Now, next month, we're doing a 3-week series called You're Invited. We'll start it the week after Labor Day, and we'll dive into God's vision for Hope City Church. Really to kind of who we are, where we're going, the vision that God has placed on this church specifically. That's not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about I want to talk about the Big C church. I want to talk about the global church. I want to talk about the historical church and how we're a part of a movement of God that started 2,000 years ago and lives out in our world today. What does that look like? How can that become stronger? I'm not sure what your childhood was like when it comes to church, but my parents became Christians when I was really young. And they were kind of nominal Christians until I was probably in elementary school, and then kind of a switch flipped, and they started going to church all the time. And what I mean all the time, I mean like whenever the doors were open. We would go to Sunday school on Sunday morning. We would then go to this little thing in between services where you get refreshments and coffee and all that. And then we would have to go to church, and we would sit in really uncomfortable pews, and we would sing hymns. And then the sermon was really long and boring. And then you know what we would do? We'd go home, and then we would come back that night, and we'd have either youth group, or we'd have like adventure club or something when I was younger, and then we'd have Sunday night church, and then we'd go to church on Wednesday night. Every time the doors were open, my parents just felt like they had to be there. And it was annoying. I hated it, right? I hated going to church every single week. Well, my junior year of high school, we started going to this church, and our youth group met on Wednesday night, and then it switched to Sunday night. And Sunday nights were the night that I played basketball. I went to the park and rec department every Sunday night, played basketball, and so this switch was not cleared with me. I did not approve it. I did not like it. And my parents were like, you're going to youth group. You can skip park and rec. You can go to youth group every Sunday. I'm like, okay. And so my junior year, our youth group started meeting at the Boys and Girls Club, and my parents were in a Bible study at the church. And so the first week of youth group, I went, and it was boring, and I didn't like it. And so the next week, I thought, well, my parents are not at the Boys Club. And so the next Sunday morning, I went to my youth pastor, and I said, hey, my parents really want me to be at the Bible study that we're having here at the church. I'm not going to be able to make it to youth group the next few weeks. They really want me to be a part of this study with them. I think it's going to grow us as a family. It's going to be really, kind of develop unity. And so then my parents went to church, and I went to the park and rec, and they had no idea I was not at the Boys Club. It was beautiful, all right? Played really well, I think. 25, 30 years later, I can remember that. And so it was working out beautifully until, unbeknownst to me, my youth pastor went to my dad a few weeks later on a Sunday morning and told him how much he's been missing me. And my dad's like, what do you mean missing him? Like, how is he missing? How are you missing him? And I'm like, well, he hasn't been there the last few weeks. He said he was with you at the Bible study. And so, just as planned, the next Sunday, or that Sunday night, I go play basketball. And as I'm playing, I see this ominous figure standing up against the fence. And it's my dad. And I see him, but I don't acknowledge him, right? And so I'm going throughout the game, and so in the middle of the game, my dad walks out into the middle of the court, grabs me, and takes me in his own car, leaves my car there, takes me in his own car, drops me off at the Boys and Girls Club. Like, that's how serious my parents were about church. And I did not go to the park and rec department the rest of the year, right? It just did not happen. Well, I don't know what your church attendance looks like, but a lot of people, when they think about church, when they think about going to church, it's more out of obligation. It's more out of guilt. It's more out of this compulsion of something that was beat into you or put into you or made you feel guilty. In 2018, CNN had an article appear on their website entitled 10 Reasons People Go to Church and 9 Reasons They Don't. And the first line of this article says this: if American religion were traded as at a stock exchange, your broker might be advising you to sell. The trend lines don't look great, and they haven't for quite some time. This is in 2018. This is 2 years before the pandemic. In the article, Pew Research polled 4,700 Americans and asked them why or why not they attended church or did not attend church at least once a month. So the baseline of the survey is, do you attend church at least once a month? If you answered yes, then they asked you why. If you answered no, they asked you why you don't. Here are the top 10 reasons why people in this article said they attend church. Number 1, to become closer to God. That's awesome. Number 2, their children will have a moral foundation. 3, to become a better person. 4, for comfort in times of trouble or sorrow. 5, I'm not offended. They find the sermons valuable. All right? I would love for that to be 1, but it's like right in the middle of the road, so it's not offensive, but not really great either, okay? To be a part of a faith community, to continue their family's religious traditions. They feel obligated to go, to meet new people or socialize, to please their family, spouse, or partner. Top 10 reasons why. All right? Here are the top 9 reasons why people say they don't go to church. They practice their faith in other ways. They're not believers. It's not relevant. They haven't found a house of worship they like. They don't like the sermons. I like how number 5 and 5 are kind of similar, right? It's just kind of middle of the road, so it doesn't make pastors feel like too horrible, but not great either. So at least that's not number 1, all right? They don't feel welcome. They don't have the time. poor health or mobility, no house of worship in their area. So when we talk about the church, the capital C church, this is pre-pandemic. Now, post-pandemic, the average American church is experiencing a 60% decline in attendance pre-COVID. Our numbers have been running between 30 and 35% each week of what we ran pre-COVID. So church attendance in 2018 was already in decline. Then you insert a global pandemic into that where everyone is dispersed in their homes, and for the year, they're told, hey, we're not gathering in groups of larger than this, larger than this, larger than this. It has become even more of a question of what is the American church going to look like in the next 10 years. If church involvement and church engagement and church attendance was already in decline, then what is the American church going to look like as we move forward? How many of you guys, show of hands, have ever taken a supplement of any kind? All right, okay. Oh, wow, a lot of it. Okay, that's good. Well, there's all kinds of supplements you can take, right? There's supplements you can take that will help you lose weight. There's supplements you take to help you gain weight. There's supplements you take to help you sleep. There's supplements you can take to help you digest food faster. There's supplements you can take to be stronger and faster and more athletic. There's all kinds of supplements. Think better, jump higher, digest food faster. So I just went through our cabinets literally this weekend, and I found a few supplements. We just moved, and so I think there's actually more somewhere in boxes. But here's just a few supplements. This one you take to lose weight. This one you take to gain weight. This one, hair, nail, skin formula. This is mine, as you know, right? Hair, nail, skin. This one right here is just a probiotic. This is digestive health, all right? These are just supplements. Now, what if I told you that, you know what, I've made a strategic decision, I've done a lot of research, and I have decided that it's best for my health not to eat food. I'm just going to take supplements. Like, I feel like that's the best dietary decision I could make. You'd be like, well, that's crazy. Why would you think that? You would think that because supplement, by its very nature and its very definition, is an add-on, right? It's not designed to be the main thing. It's designed to supplement, to come alongside of the main thing. It's not designed to provide you with the nutrients and the vitamins that your body actually needs. It's designed to provide you with additional nutrients and additional vitamins and additional amino acids or whatever it is, fish oil, whatever you want to put in the supplement to help your life be better in addition to food. And what has taken place in our culture over the last several years, probably over the last 25 years, especially over the last year, is that in our culture, there was a time where the church was considered essential. Now, that word essential brings up a lot of emotions, right? Because we had this huge debate about a year and a half ago over what is essential, what's not essential. And it was determined by the government that churches were essential, not to gather, but to still continue in services. But there was a time in our culture where people, even people who did not go to church, would consider the church essential for spiritual growth. Not even talking about people who follow Jesus. I'm not talking about people who claim to be followers of Christ. People in the world would say, yeah, the church, if you want to grow spiritually, the church is not a supplement. It is an essential organization. It's an essential community for you to be a part of to grow in your relationship with God. But where we are now in our culture, and not even in the world, where we are now but from people who follow Jesus is, we see the church as a supplement and not as essential. It's something that we do when we're in town. It's a place we go if we're not traveling. It's something that we do and engage in if we don't have anything else planned. If we can wake up in time, if we can go and still get to lunch on time, then we'll engage. We don't see the church as an essential aspect to our relationship with Jesus. It's just something that we add on to our relationship with Jesus to hopefully make it better. Now, the church has responsibility in this. Right? This isn't just people's fault. The church has been known for judgment and not love, for marginalizing people and not accepting them, for racism, not inclusion, for rule keeping, not grace. The church has part of the ownership in this cultural shift where people just say, you know what? If I go to church, it's just to help my spiritual growth. It's not vital to my spiritual growth. It's just an add-on. So we have, as pastors, as leaders in the church, individual churches, and the global church has ownership in how people view the church and how people engage in the church. But what if I told you that Jesus has something so different in mind? Right? And if you're not a follower of Jesus, this is more of like a look into who we're supposed to be as a church. This really is a message for people who follow Jesus. Because people who follow Jesus should see the church as essential to their life, essential to their spiritual growth, essential to their relationship with God. See, the idea of the church originated with Jesus. In fact, not only the idea of the church originated with Jesus, but Jesus actually laid down his life for the church. He came to live a sinless life, to offer his life as a sacrifice, to allow us to experience a relationship with God, and then to establish a community of people that would live and represent him. And so the birth, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus was, by all accounts throughout Scripture, God's plan to redeem a world not just back to himself, but back to each other. There was reconciliation that Jesus brought to us as a community. And so in the New Testament, in the book of Matthew, Jesus is having this conversation with the disciples because there's all kinds of momentum. There's also all kinds of controversy that are surrounding his ministry. And so people are trying to get to him to get miracles. The religious leaders are trying to get to him to kill him. People are saying things about him that may or may not be true. And so all of this stuff comes back to Jesus. This is before Twitter and Instagram, right? This is before social media, and Jesus has just kind of blown up. And so Jesus is having a conversation with his disciples. He says, hey, there's a lot of rumors out there. There's people saying a lot of stuff about me. What are they saying? And one of his disciples say, well, some say you're like Moses reincarnated. Some say that you're like Elijah come back from the dead. And Jesus says, well, who do you say that I am? And we don't know if any other disciple said anything, but we do know that Peter says this. He says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus responds to Peter and says this, and I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now, you can read all kinds of commentaries on what, the word Peter actually does mean rock. But what Jesus is saying is on the testimony of Jesus being the Christ, the Son of the living God, that is the foundation by which Jesus, through the apostles and through Peter, would begin to build his church. Now, the church is mentioned. The word ecclesia is the word for church. It actually means set apart ones. It means people who are set apart. It's mentioned 144 times in the New Testament, and this is the very first time. Jesus speaks this word for the very first time, and he paints a picture of a community of people that are set apart. And what they're set apart to do and who they're set apart to become would be so powerful, would be so strong, that all of the forces of evil, every single force of hell, every spiritual force that could ever come against what Jesus came to establish in the ecclesia, the set apart ones, the church, would not overcome it. You talk about stronger. You talk about a force to be reckoned with. You talk about an immovable object. You talk about an unstoppable force. See, from the time of Jesus, the church was never about a place people would go. It was about who people would become as they followed Jesus. And so the Apostle Paul, he starts churches, and he goes from city to city sharing the good news of Jesus and establishing communities that are set apart from the world. He starts with Jews, and so the Jewish people, they have this wake-up call, and they realize, man, this was the Messiah, and we need to follow him. And so they set aside their Jewish religion, and they begin a relationship with Jesus, and they start following Jesus. And Paul establishes churches that were made up of former Jews. But the most radical thing that Paul did and the disciples did is they began to go to people who had no access to God before. They began to go to people who were not God's chosen people, who were called Gentiles. And the word Gentiles just means non-Jewish. And he would go to these cities and he would start these churches. And people would fall in love with Jesus, and they would fall in love with grace, and they would begin to share about the person of Jesus and the work of Jesus and the sacrifice of Jesus and the grace of God. And people would come to Christ through Paul's message. And then Paul would leave, and he would go to another city. And he would often, much of the New Testament is written by the Apostle Paul, and it's actually letters that he would write back to these churches that he established. Because when you establish churches of people who've grown up with the Jewish faith, they start mixing in the Jewish faith, and it gets really cloudy and messy. And so oftentimes he would write to them and say, hey, Jesus plus nothing equals everything. You guys are trying to add stuff to grace, take it all out. You don't have to have works. That was the message that Paul would typically send to former Jewish people who had established Christian churches, set apart ones. And then you would have these Gentile churches, and they had no religious background, but they had all of these pagan rituals and all of these things that they would do. They would sacrifice kids. They would, there would be sexual content in churches. Like there was a part of like all of their worship, their pagan worship, that definitely did not mix with the ministry of Jesus. And so he would have to write to them and say, hey, you guys, I love your enthusiasm, but you're going way overboard in this, this, and this. And so in the book of Ephesians, or the letter to the Ephesians, Paul writes this church in Ephesus, and he wants to establish Jesus' vision for the church. What is the church supposed to look like? And he says this in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 10 through 19. He's talking about Jesus. It says, his intent was that now, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms, according to his eternal purpose that he accomplished in Christ Jesus our Lord. In Jesus, and through faith in Jesus, we may approach God with freedom and confidence. For this reason, I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name. I pray that out of his glorious riches, he may strengthen you with power to be stronger through his Spirit, your inner being. Then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust in him, and your roots will grow down into God's love and keep you strong. And so with the few minutes that I have left, I want to just give some practical things of what the church looks like as we lean into some of the truths that Paul writes to the church in Ephesus about. If there's ever been a declaration of the wonder and significance of the church, it's in Ephesians chapter 3. And one of the things that we have to live with and know is that, and I mentioned this, is that when Jesus died on the cross, he didn't just die on the cross to reconcile us to God. He died on the cross to create a new community, a new people, to reconcile us to one another. And so the gospel isn't just about you being in a relationship with God. The gospel is about us being in a covenant relationship with one another as we're reconciled back to God. And so what does that look like? And the first thing I put in your notes is that the wisdom of God is revealed when we move together. And move together really is just similar to, or not similar, it's basically unity. All right, there's some symmetrical aspects to my points today, so move together sounded better than unity, all right? So you'll see that in just a second. Look at verse 10 of Ephesians chapter 3. His intent was that now, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms. Now, I want to stop here, because this word manifold, it's Greek, and it's only used in the Bible one time. This is the only time in all of Scripture that this word manifold is used. And it's not a common word. The literal meaning of it is it means to embroider. It means to weave together. And it has this idea in Greek culture of weaving together beautiful tapestry to make garments. And so Paul uses this word to catch the Ephesians' attention, to let them know just how complex and just how beautiful and just how multifaceted and multi-layered God's wisdom is. And he says that the church is the mechanism, the church is the vehicle by which God's wisdom, God's manifold, God's beautifully, masterfully, multifaceted, woven together wisdom will be displayed to the world. The mechanism by which God will display good judgment, God will display discernment, God will display good decisions is through the church. Now, think about how radical this is to a first century person hearing this for the first time. Because up until this point in human history, up until Jesus, God's wisdom was reserved for a very select group of people. In the Old Testament, it was only reserved for Abraham initially, then it was Moses, then Joshua. Then as you go throughout the books of the prophets actually got the wisdom of God, and they became the mouthpiece of God, and they began to speak on God's behalf. And then in the New Testament, it became religious leaders and how they interpreted the Torah, how they interpreted the Scriptures, and they became the mouthpiece and the mechanism by which the Jewish people received God's wisdom. And now Paul is saying, hey, everything has changed. The way this world is going to see God's presence, the way this world is going to know God's discernment, the way this world is going to know about God is going to be through the church. The church is going to be the dispenser of God's wisdom. The church is proof of God in this world. That's what Paul is saying. Now, let me ask you to think about the people in your life that are far from God. The people that in your life who don't go to church, who have no relationship with God, do you think when they think about the church, they automatically think about God's wisdom? No, they think about, what are those bozos doing, right? Like the opposite of wisdom is usually how people outside the church perceive those of us in the church. Right? And so we have become known more for what we're against than what we're for. And so we alienate people who are far from God, and people who look at the church from the outside, they don't see God's activity. They don't see God's wisdom. They don't see God's discernment. They don't see God's judgment, not in a good way. They see God's judgment in a bad way. They don't think, man, those people are so unified and so together, God must be in their midst. They see us arguing on Twitter. They see us crashing and clashing with each other on social media. They see us taking political sides. They see us alienating one another more than loving one another. And that leads me to my next point. That's this: the love of God is displayed when we grow together. The wisdom of God is revealed when we move together, when we have unity. And the love of God is displayed when we grow together. Look at verse 17. It says, "Then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust him, and your roots will go down deep into God's love and keep you strong." Like, love is at the central message of Jesus. Over the last few months, I've been doing a lot of research on my family of origin. I'm on Ancestry.com a lot, and I'm looking at family roots and trying to figure out, who my ancestors were. And Elijah and his wife Julia are in town this weekend from Portland, and so he's like geeking out with me, and he's showing me pictures of like great-great-great-grandfathers that he found that were in the Civil War and all this stuff, and so we've been kind of geeking out about it. And why is that important? Why does Ancestry.com even exist? Because as you determine where you come from, you can see patterns, you can see traits, you can see behavior patterns, you can see how people have become who they've become based on who they're related to. People are often determined by who their parents were and where they came from. Family roots determine a lot about our upbringing, about our values, about our preferences and life experiences. And what Paul is saying here is the church should not be rooted in a political party. The church should not be rooted in an educational ideology. The church should not be rooted even in doctrine. The church should be rooted in love. Like when you dig to the deepest crevices of the church, when you strip everything back, you take away the worship, and you take away the preaching, and you take away the coffee, and you take away the kids' ministry, and you take away the student, you take everything away. What should be there, what should be evident is how people love not just each other in the church, but how they love people outside the church. If we want the world to believe that God is good, then the world has to see good coming from the church. If we want people to believe that God is love, then the world needs to see us loving. It's really pretty simple. It's not easy, but it's simple. Now, I want to dive into something because I think it's important. He uses this word rooted, and rooted means planted, right? Like, rooted is not something that you just get by throwing seed. Rooted is something that you get over time. Like when you have deep roots in something, it's something that it's not been microwaved, right? It's been like slow cooked. few months ago, about probably 6 or 8 months ago, I got an email from a person who used to go to Hope City, and a few months before that, they had emailed me and saying that, with the pandemic and, staying at home, that the church had become, too far for them to drive. And you guys know I'm all about the Big C church, right? And we say all the time, if Hope City isn't a place that you feel like you can belong, I'll help you find another church. And so that's what I did with this person that emailed me. He emailed me and said, hey, I know we haven't talked in a while. I'm going through a crisis. I thought I would reach out to you. And I had helped him find another local church that was closer to his house. And so he's like, do you think that we could get together this week? I just really need to talk. And so I emailed him back nicely, and we have a good relationship. And I said, well, why don't you email the pastor of the church that you go to? And he's like, well, he doesn't meet with people. I'm like, oh, okay. So I said, okay, well, we'll meet. He's like, I really need your advice. I really need you to speak into the situation. So we sit down, and he starts talking about how his son had wandered away from church, wandered away from God, isn't going to church, and he just really needed my advice, really needed my help, and he's making a lot of poor decisions and just really in crisis, and what I think he should do, and how can you help me get my son into a church and get him plugged in? Not Hope City, but just a church. And I said, well, I would love to help you do that. He's like, well, good. Will you call him? You call my son and tell him he needs to go to church. And I said, hey, you invited me to this lunch, right? I said, do you really want my advice? Because I'm getting ready to give it to you. He's like, yeah, what should I do? I said, when is the last time you've been to church? Well, I don't know. Maybe 6 or 8 months ago, before Hope City shut down. Okay. Are you in a small group? No. Are you in a Bible study? No. Are you in any other group outside of your family that is actually pouring into you spiritually? No. But you want me to call your son and tell him he needs to get his life together spiritually. Right? And so we place these expectations on other people in our life to get their stuff together. And Paul's saying, hey, what about your roots? Are you planted anywhere? Right? And I say that I have this message that I say like once every year, once or twice every year, and I think today's a good day to say it, is one of the most important things that you can do for your spiritual life is to be planted, to be rooted in a church. And I'm saying this with all authenticity and all sincerity. If Hope City is not that place, then I'll help you find some place, because your spiritual growth is more important to me than your church attendance. Right? But we cannot expect our spiritual life to grow and to flourish if we're not planted, if we're not rooted. That's why we have rooted. That's why we have connection groups. That's why we have Bible studies, because we want you to be rooted. We want you to go so deep into God's love that you emanate love to other people. It's just second nature, and that happens as you're rooted in a church. Finally, the fullness of God is experienced when we come together. The fullness of God is experienced when we come together. I learned this week. I'd never noticed this before. This is pretty incredible. Look at what he says in verse 18 and 19. He says, and may you have the power to understand, as all of God's people should, how wide and how long and how high and how deep is what? God's rules, God's mandates, God's obligation. No, he wants you to understand how wide and deep and vast is God's love. And to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure, look at this, of all the fullness of God. When the church is being the capital C church, when the church is living out God's vision, you are filled not with part of God, but the fullness of God. You're filled with the fullness of God's mercy. You're filled with the fullness of God's light. You're filled with the fullness of God's love. You're filled with the fullness of God's wisdom. You're filled with the fullness of everything and every aspect of God. Paul says it is poured into you as you understand how vast, how wide, and how deep God's love is. You talk about strong. You have the fullness of God in you. That is strong. And that's why Jesus says the gates of hell can't overcome it. Because every single person who's a part of the church, who calls themselves a follower of Jesus, has the fullness of God at their disposal. How many of you guys watch the Olympics? Watch the Olympics? I tried to watch the Olympics. I really did. I had good intentions. Trish really watched a lot of the Olympics, and we kind of got in arguments because I was watching the NBA draft and summer league. She's like, how can you watch summer league when the Olympics are on? The Olympics threw me off because I would get updates on my phone at 7 in the morning about somebody who won an event that they were going to show that night. And I'm like, well, that's like a rerun, right? Like, I already know that Simone Biles got bronze. I don't want to watch her get bronze, right? That's just felt like a waste of time. So that was hard to watch it that way. And also it was hard because there was no fans in the stands. And so fans add this element of intensity, and fans add this element of of energy, and fans add this element of cheering and creating this moment in Olympic history, and there's no fans. And it kind of lacked what I thought the Olympics should be. And you talk about a post-pandemic world where people aren't coming back to church. It's easy to view yourself as the fans in the stands, or the stands in the fans. The fans in the stands, and I'm on a stage, and there's lights on me, and I'm the athlete. I'm the one that's performing for you, right? And that's oftentimes how we view the church. And I'll just be honest with you, straight up authentic with you. I've been guilty of that too, because I've said things like this. Maybe not to you, but to my wife and privately. Why do people feel comfortable going to a Dave Matthews concert and packing out Verizon or Roof or whatever it's called now, but they don't feel comfortable coming to church? What have I done? I've made this an event people attend.